Maria Santos had always believed she was meant to disappear into the background. Growing up in a small farming town in Texas, she learned early that keeping quiet and staying out of sight was the safest way to navigate life. Her father worked double shifts at the local factory. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families across town. And Maria spent most of her childhood watching her younger siblings while dreaming of something bigger than the four walls of their cramped apartment. At 17, when her guidance counselor mentioned military service as a way to pay for college, Maria felt something stir inside her chest. It wasn't excitement exactly, more like recognition. The military seemed like a place where she could serve something greater than herself while remaining invisible in the ranks. She had always been good at following orders, at blending in, at making herself useful without drawing attention. The day she walked into the recruitment office, Sergeant Johnson looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. Maria was small, barely 5 feet 4 inches, with calloused hands and worn sneakers that had seen better days. When she mentioned wanting to join the Army, Johnson's eyebrows shot up. "You sure about this, sweetheart? Military life isn't exactly a summer camp." Maria's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm sure, sir." What Johnson didn't know was that Maria had been preparing for this moment for months. She had been running 5 miles every morning before school, doing push-ups and sit-ups in her bedroom until her muscles burned, and reading every military manual she could get her hands on from the local library. She had mapped out her future with the precision of a battle plan: serve her country, earn money for college, and, finally, make something of herself. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was everything she had expected, and worse. The drill sergeants screamed until their faces turned red. The physical demands pushed her body to its absolute limits, and the other recruits seemed to view her as either competition or irrelevant. Maria chose irrelevant. She kept her head down, followed every order without question, and slowly, methodically, proved that she belonged. During the obstacle course runs, while other recruits struggled or complained, Maria simply endured. When they had to crawl through mud under barbed wire, she focused on moving forward 1 inch at a time. When they had to carry heavy packs for miles in the blazing heat, she thought about her mother's hands, cracked and bleeding from years of scrubbing floors, and reminded herself that this was temporary pain for permanent change. Her drill sergeant, Staff Sergeant Williams, noticed her quiet competence but rarely acknowledged it directly. Maria preferred it that way. Recognition meant attention, and attention meant becoming a target. She had learned that lesson well in high school, where standing out in any way usually led to trouble. After graduating from basic training, Maria was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg. The transition from training to real military life was jarring. Suddenly, she wasn't just practicing maneuvers and following training protocols. She was part of an actual unit with a real mission, surrounded by soldiers who had already proven themselves in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her first deployment came 8 months later. Afghanistan was a world away from anything she had ever imagined. The heat was oppressive, the landscape alien and hostile, and the constant threat of danger made every moment feel electrically charged. Maria's unit was stationed at a forward operating base in Kandahar province, where their primary mission involved convoy security and base defense. For the first few weeks, Maria felt like she was watching everything through glass. The other soldiers in her unit had already formed tight bonds, sharing inside jokes and stories from previous deployments. She was the new person, the outsider, the one who hadn't yet proven herself under fire. So she did what she had always done. She made herself useful and tried to stay invisible. She volunteered for extra duties without being asked. She cleaned weapons with meticulous care, organized supply inventories with obsessive precision, and studied tactical manuals during her free time while other soldiers played video games or wrote letters home. When her squad leader, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, noticed her attention to detail, he started giving her more complex responsibilities. "Santos," he said one morning after she had completed a particularly thorough inspection of their vehicle's communications equipment, "you might actually know what you're doing." It was the closest thing to praise she had received since arriving, and Maria felt a small warmth spread through her chest. But she quickly pushed the feeling aside. Praise meant visibility, and visibility meant risk. The first time her convoy came under attack, Maria discovered something about herself that she hadn't known existed. As bullets pinged off their armored vehicle and explosions erupted around them, instead of panic, she felt a strange calm settle over her. While other soldiers shouted and scrambled, Maria methodically checked her equipment, secured their radio communications, and helped coordinate their response with crystal-clear precision. Later, as they conducted their after-action review, Rodriguez looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "Good work out there, Santos. You kept your head when things got crazy." Maria nodded, but didn't say much. Inside, though, something had shifted. For the first time in her life, she had been in a situation where staying invisible wasn't possible, where her actions directly impacted the safety of the people around her. And, instead of crumbling under the pressure, she had risen to meet it. Over the following months, Maria's reputation for steady competence began to spread quietly through the unit. She wasn't the loudest soldier or the most physically imposing, but she was reliable in ways that mattered when lives were on the line. When equipment needed to be maintained, Maria did it right the first time. When communications needed to be clear under pressure, Maria's voice cut through the chaos with calm precision. Her squad began to depend on her in small but significant ways. Rodriguez started assigning her to coordinate with other units during complex operations. The medic, Doc Peterson, began asking for her help when treating wounded soldiers because her steady hands and calm demeanor helped keep patients stable. Even the most seasoned veterans in the unit began to nod respectfully when she passed. But Maria still saw herself as invisible, as someone who simply did her job without attracting attention. She wrote brief, practical letters home to her family, never mentioning the attacks or the dangers, focusing instead on the landscape and the people she had met. She didn't want them to worry, and she didn't want to make her service sound more dramatic than it was. What she didn't realize was that her quiet competence had already begun attracting attention from people far above her pay grade. Her company commander, Captain Hayes, had noticed her name appearing repeatedly in positive reports. Her battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, had heard multiple squad leaders praise her performance during briefings. The patch on Maria's uniform was standard issue, nothing that distinguished her from any other soldier in her unit. It displayed her rank, her unit designation, and the flag of the country she served. To her, it was just part of the uniform, as unremarkable as her boots or her helmet. She had no idea that this simple patch, worn by thousands of other soldiers, would soon catch the attention of someone whose notice would change everything. As her deployment progressed, Maria found herself taking on increasingly complex responsibilities. She was assigned to help coordinate logistics between different units, a role that required her to understand the broader strategic picture beyond her immediate squad. She began studying intelligence reports and operational plans with the same methodical attention she had always brought to equipment maintenance. During one particularly complex operation, when multiple units needed to coordinate movements across a large area of hostile territory, Maria's ability to track details and maintain clear communications proved invaluable. She spent 18 straight hours in the operations center, helping coordinate supply drops, medical evacuations, and tactical updates while under constant threat of attack. When the operation concluded successfully with minimal casualties, Rodriguez pulled her aside. "Santos, you realize what you just did, right? You helped coordinate one of the most complex ops this battalion has run all year. And you did it like you were organizing a grocery list." Maria shrugged, genuinely uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed to be done, Sergeant." "No, you did what a lot of people couldn't do. You might want to start thinking about what comes next for you in this army." But Maria wasn't thinking about what came next. She was focused on the mission, on the people counting on her, on the small daily acts of service that made her feel like she was finally contributing something meaningful to the world. She had found her place in the background, supporting others and making sure things ran smoothly. She had no way of knowing that her name had already reached the desk of General Patricia Morrison, the commanding general overseeing operations in their sector. Morrison was known throughout the military for her ability to identify exceptional talent at every level, from the newest recruits to senior officers. She had a reputation for noticing people that others overlooked and for understanding that the most crucial contributions often came from the soldiers who never sought recognition. When Morrison reviewed the after-action reports from the recent complex operation, one name appeared repeatedly in the acknowledgments and recommendations sections, not as a hero or a standout performer, but as someone whose steady competence had been essential to the mission's success. It was exactly the kind of quiet excellence that Morrison valued most highly. As Maria cleaned her rifle that evening, watching the sun set over the dusty landscape of Afghanistan, she had no idea that her career was about to change direction dramatically. She was still thinking of herself as invisible, as someone who served best by staying in the background and supporting others. Tomorrow, General Morrison would arrive for an unannounced inspection of their base. And when she saw Maria wearing that unremarkable patch, doing her unremarkable job with remarkable competence, everything would change. But tonight, Maria Santos was still invisible, still focused on the simple act of serving others without expecting recognition. She had no way of knowing that invisibility was exactly what would make her impossible to ignore. General Patricia Morrison had built her career on seeing what others missed. While other officers focused on the obvious leaders, the decorated heroes, and the high-profile achievers, Morrison had learned to identify the quiet professionals who formed the backbone of every successful military operation. She had a theory that the most important people in any organization were often the ones who worked hardest to remain unnoticed. This philosophy had served her well throughout her 30-year career. As a young lieutenant, she had been mentored by a colonel who taught her that real leadership meant understanding every level of an organization, from the generals making strategic decisions to the privates maintaining equipment in the motor pools. Now, as a 3-star general commanding thousands of soldiers across multiple bases, she made it a priority to get out among the troops and observe them in their natural environment. Her arrival at the Forward Operating Base in Kandahar Province was intentionally unannounced. Morrison believed that scheduled visits produced theater, carefully choreographed performances that told her nothing about how a unit actually functioned. Unannounced visits revealed truth, how soldiers really worked when they thought nobody important was watching, how leaders really led when they weren't trying to impress visiting dignitaries, how the day-to-day operations actually functioned. She arrived by helicopter just after dawn, accompanied only by her aide-de-camp and a small security detail. The base was already fully operational, with soldiers going about their morning routines without the artificial polish that accompanied formal inspections. Morrison watched with satisfaction as the base's leadership scrambled to organize proper protocols, while the working soldiers simply continued doing their jobs. Colonel Patterson, the base commander, hurried across the landing zone to greet her, his uniform hastily straightened and his expression carefully composed professional courtesy mixed with barely concealed anxiety. "General Morrison, we weren't expecting you, ma'am. If you had given us advance notice, we could have prepared a proper reception." Morrison smiled slightly. "Colonel, if I had wanted a proper reception, I would have given you advance notice. I'm here to see how your people actually work, not how well they can put on a show." As they walked through the base, Morrison paid careful attention to the details that most visitors overlooked. She noticed which soldiers made eye contact and which ones focused intently on their tasks. She observed how equipment was maintained, how work areas were organized, and how people interacted when they thought nobody was evaluating them. In the communications center, she watched technicians monitoring multiple radio frequencies with intense concentration. In the motor pool, she observed mechanics working on vehicle maintenance with methodical precision. In the medical facility, she saw staff preparing for the day's potential casualties with quiet professionalism. But it was in the operations center that something caught her attention in a way that made her pause mid-conversation with Colonel Patterson. A young soldier was working at a computer terminal, updating logistical databases with information from overnight reports. The soldier's movements were economical and precise, fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced efficiency. What struck Morrison wasn't the speed of the work, but the obvious care with which it was being done. Every entry was double-checked, every detail verified against multiple sources. "Who was that soldier?" Morrison asked, interrupting Patterson's explanation about their latest operational achievements. Patterson followed her gaze and seemed slightly surprised by the question. "That's Private First Class Santos, ma'am. She's one of our logistics specialists. Very reliable soldier." Morrison watched Santos work for another moment. The young woman was completely absorbed in her task, focused with the kind of intensity that suggested she understood the importance of accuracy in her work. Other soldiers in the operations center moved around her, but she remained centered on her computer screen, methodically working through what was obviously a complex series of updates and cross-references. "How long has she been with the unit?" "About 8 months, ma'am. This is her first deployment. She came to us straight from AIT." Morrison made a mental note and continued her tour. But throughout the morning, she found herself thinking about the focused young soldier in the operations center. There had been something about Santos's demeanor that suggested depth beyond her rank and experience. During lunch with the unit's senior leadership, Morrison asked seemingly casual questions about personnel and operations. She learned that Santos had quickly become one of the most dependable soldiers in the unit, that she volunteered for additional duties without being asked, and that she had played a crucial role in coordinating several recent complex operations. She's the kind of soldier you forget about until you need something done right, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez explained when Morrison asked about his most reliable people. Santos doesn't make noise, doesn't cause problems, just gets her work done and helps everyone else get theirs done too. That's interesting, Morrison replied. In my experience, the soldiers you forget about are often the ones you should remember most. After lunch, Morrison decided to take an unescorted walk through the base. Her aide-de-camp looked nervous about the deviation from protocol, but Morrison had learned more from unstructured observations than from any number of formal briefings. She found herself back at the operations center, where Santos was still working at her terminal. The afternoon shift had brought different personnel, and Morrison watched as various soldiers approached Santos for assistance with technical problems, logistical questions, and equipment issues. Without exception, Santos helped each person with patience and competence, often going beyond what was strictly required to ensure they had everything they needed. Morrison positioned herself where she could observe without being obvious about it. She watched Santos coordinate a supply request from another unit, cross-reference maintenance schedules for multiple vehicles, and help a confused soldier navigate a complex bureaucratic requirement. Through it all, Santos maintained the same focused demeanor, treating each task with equal attention regardless of its apparent importance. What impressed Morrison most was not Santos's technical competence, though that was clearly excellent, but her approach to the work itself. She treated every request as if it were personally important to her, every detail as if accuracy were a matter of life and death, which, Morrison realized, in a combat zone, it often was. When Santos finally took a break and walked outside for some fresh air, Morrison followed at a discreet distance. She watched the young soldier sit on a concrete barrier, pull out a small notebook, and begin writing what appeared to be a letter. Even during her break, Santos's posture remained alert, her attention occasionally shifting to monitor activity around the base. Morrison approached quietly and sat down nearby. Santos immediately recognized her and started to stand, but Morrison waved her back down. At ease, soldier. Just taking a break myself. Santos nodded politely, but remained visibly tense. Morrison could practically feel the young woman trying to make herself invisible to avoid drawing attention from such a senior officer. I've been watching you work today, Morrison said conversationally. Impressive attention to detail. Thank you, ma'am. Just doing my job. Morrison smiled at the standard response, but she noticed that Santos's discomfort seemed genuine rather than false modesty. This was someone who truly didn't seek recognition, who seemed actively uncomfortable with praise. What's that patch on your shoulder? Morrison asked, pointing to a small unit designation on Santos's uniform. Santos looked down at her shoulder, seeming confused by the question. It's my unit patch, ma'am. Standard issue. Morrison leaned closer to examine the patch. It was indeed standard issue, displaying Santos's unit designation and rank. But, as Morrison looked at it, she noticed something that made her pause. The patch was perfectly maintained, not just clean but carefully positioned with mathematical precision. The thread securing it to the uniform had been sewn with meticulous attention to detail, each stitch exactly the same length and tension as the others. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that 99% of officers would never notice. But Morrison had learned to pay attention to small things, because small things often revealed important truths about character and values. You sewed this yourself, Morrison observed. Santos looked surprised by the comment. Yes, ma'am. Regulations require proper uniform maintenance. But you could have had someone else do it. Most soldiers take their uniforms to the alteration shop. Santos seemed genuinely puzzled by the suggestion. Ma'am, it's my uniform. My responsibility. Morrison studied the young woman's face, seeing something that confirmed her initial impression. Santos wasn't trying to impress anyone with her attention to detail. She maintained her uniform to exacting standards because she believed it was the right thing to do, because she understood that even small details mattered when you were representing something larger than yourself. Where are you from, Santos? Texas, ma'am. Small town called Presidio. Morrison nodded. She had visited hundreds of small towns throughout her career, places where young people grew up understanding that individual actions reflected on their families, their communities, and their values. Places where doing things right wasn't about recognition, but about responsibility. What made you join the Army? Santos considered the question seriously before answering. Wanted to serve something bigger than myself, ma'am. Wanted to make a difference. And have you? Made a difference? I hope so, ma'am. I try to do my part. Morrison spent another few minutes in casual conversation with Santos, asking about her experiences, her goals, and her perspective on military service. With each answer, she became more convinced that she was looking at exactly the kind of soldier the Army needed to identify and develop. Santos spoke thoughtfully about her role in the unit, describing her work in terms of how it supported others rather than how it advanced her own career. She talked about the importance of accuracy in logistics, about how small mistakes in supply management could have serious consequences for soldiers in dangerous situations. She discussed her responsibilities with the gravity of someone who understood that other people's lives might depend on how well she did her job. When Morrison finally stood to continue her tour, she made a mental note to have a longer conversation with Colonel Patterson about Santos's career trajectory. This was exactly the kind of quiet professional that the Army needed to identify early and develop carefully. As she walked away, Morrison looked back once to see Santos returning to the operations center, already refocusing on the afternoon's tasks with the same methodical intensity she had observed earlier. The patch on Santos's shoulder caught the afternoon sunlight, its precise placement and careful maintenance a small but telling symbol of the character beneath the uniform. Morrison had seen thousands of soldiers throughout her career, from fresh recruits to seasoned veterans, from Medal of Honor recipients to soldiers who had never received formal recognition for their service. She had learned to distinguish between those who served for personal advancement and those who served out of genuine commitment to something larger than themselves. In Santos, she recognized someone special not because of what she had accomplished, but because of how she approached every task with the same unwavering commitment to excellence. The patch on her uniform was just fabric and thread, standard issue equipment that identified her unit and rank. But the way Santos wore it, maintained it, and what it represented to her revealed something about character that couldn't be taught or faked. As Morrison completed her tour of the base, she found herself thinking about the strategic challenges facing the military and the kind of leaders who would be needed to address them. The Army needed people who understood that excellence was a daily choice, not an occasional achievement. It needed people who took pride in doing ordinary things extraordinarily well, who understood that the small details were often the most important ones. That evening, as Morrison prepared to depart for her next destination, she made a decision that would change Santos's life forever. She had seen enough to know that this quiet young soldier represented exactly the kind of potential the Army needed to recognize and nurture. Tomorrow, Santos would receive orders that would take her far from the forward operating base, where she thought she was invisible. But tonight, she was still just another soldier doing her job, unaware that a general had seen something in a simple uniform patch that would reshape her entire future. Maria Santos was cleaning her rifle for the third time that week when Sergeant First Class Rodriguez appeared at her bunk with an expression she had never seen before. It was somewhere between confusion and concern, with an undertone of something that might have been awe. "Santos, you need to report to Colonel Patterson's office. Right now." Maria's hands stilled on the cleaning rod. In 8 months of deployment, she had never been summoned to the colonel's office. Soldiers at her level didn't typically have face-to-face meetings with battalion commanders unless something had gone seriously wrong. "What did I do, Sergeant?" Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "I honestly don't know, Santos. But when the colonel's aide came looking for you, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Said it was urgent, and came straight from the top." Maria's mind raced through the previous weeks, searching for any mistake she might have made, any regulation she might have violated, any reason why she would be called before senior leadership. She came up empty. Her work had been thorough, her conduct exemplary, her performance consistently above standard. As she walked across the base toward the administrative buildings, Maria felt the familiar sensation of trying to make herself invisible. Other soldiers stopped their conversations to watch her pass, and she could see questions in their eyes. Word traveled fast on a small base, and everyone would soon know that Private First Class Santos had been summoned to see the colonel. The administrative building felt different from the operational areas where Maria spent her time. The halls were quieter, the atmosphere more formal, filled with the kind of meetings and decisions that happened far above her pay grade. She had been inside exactly once before, during her initial in-processing, and she remembered feeling like an intruder in a world where she didn't belong. Colonel Patterson's aide, Staff Sergeant Williams, looked up from his desk when she entered the outer office. His expression was professionally neutral, but Maria caught something in his eyes that made her even more nervous. Private First Class Santos reporting, as ordered, Sergeant. Williams nodded and stood up, straightening his uniform with the precision of someone about to deliver important news. The colonel is expecting you. Go right in. Maria knocked twice on the office door and waited for permission to enter. When Colonel Patterson called out, she stepped inside and rendered the sharpest salute of her military career. Private First Class Santos reporting, as ordered, sir. Colonel Patterson returned her salute, then gestured toward a chair across from his desk. The office was larger than any space Maria had been in since arriving at the base, with maps covering the walls and stacks of official documents arranged in precise piles across every surface. Sit down, Santos. We need to talk. Maria perched on the edge of the chair, her posture rigidly correct, her hands folded in her lap. She had no idea what to expect, but every instinct told her to be prepared for the worst. Patterson studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He was a career officer with 26 years of service, a man who had commanded soldiers in 3 different theaters of operation and earned a reputation for fairness and competence. But, right now, he looked like someone trying to solve a complicated puzzle. Santos, how long have you been with this unit? 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, sir. Patterson nodded, consulting a file folder on his desk. And, in that time, how would you assess your performance? Maria considered the question carefully. Military life had taught her to be honest but modest, to acknowledge her contributions without overstating them. I believe I've performed my duties satisfactorily, sir. I've tried to meet the standards expected of me and support my fellow soldiers to the best of my ability. Satisfactorily. Patterson repeated the word as if testing its accuracy. Is that really how you would describe coordination of a complex multi-unit operation that resulted in successful completion of the mission with 0 casualties? Maria blinked, surprised that he was referencing her role in the recent logistics coordination. Sir, I was just doing my job, following orders and ensuring accurate communication. Just doing your job. Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying her with increased interest. Santos, do you know why you're here? No, sir. I assume I must have made some mistake, but I can't think of what it might be. Patterson opened the file folder and pulled out several documents. Maria caught glimpses of official letterheads and formal typography, the kind of paperwork that meant important decisions were being made. You haven't made a mistake, Santos. Quite the opposite. You've attracted attention from some very senior people who believe you have potential that exceeds your current position. Maria felt a cold sensation in her stomach. Attention from senior people was exactly what she had spent her entire military career trying to avoid. Recognition meant visibility, and visibility meant becoming a target for expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Patterson pulled out a photograph and placed it on the desk where Maria could see it. It showed her working at her computer terminal in the operations center, completely absorbed in her task. The photo had been taken from a distance, capturing her natural demeanor when she thought nobody was watching. This photograph was taken 3 days ago during an unannounced visit by General Morrison. Do you remember meeting General Morrison? Maria's eyes widened. She remembered the brief conversation outside the operations center, the general's questions about her uniform patch, the casual tone that had somehow felt more intense than any formal evaluation she had ever received. Yes, sir. We spoke briefly during her visit. According to General Morrison's report, that brief conversation, combined with her observations of your work, led her to conclude that you represent exactly the kind of soldier the Army needs to identify and develop at the highest levels. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp or understand. Maria stared at Colonel Patterson, waiting for him to explain that there had been some mistake, that the general had meant to single out someone else, someone more qualified and deserving of such attention. Sir, I think there might be some confusion. I'm just a logistics specialist. I maintain databases and coordinate supply requests. I'm not leadership material. Patterson leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Santos, let me tell you what General Morrison wrote in her report. She said that in 30 years of military service, she has rarely encountered a soldier who combines technical competence, attention to detail, and genuine commitment to service in the way you do. She said watching you work reminded her of why she chose to make the Army her career. Maria felt dizzy. The words didn't seem to apply to her, didn't match her understanding of herself or her place in the military hierarchy. She was the soldier who stayed in the background, who supported others, who made sure things ran smoothly without drawing attention to herself. Sir, I appreciate General Morrison's confidence, but I think she might have overestimated my abilities. Patterson stood up and walked around the desk, sitting in the chair next to Maria rather than maintaining the formal distance of his position behind the desk. It was a gesture that made the conversation feel more personal, more serious. Santos, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you believe you're good at what you do? Maria considered the question carefully. False modesty wouldn't serve anyone, but she also didn't want to appear arrogant or presumptuous. I believe I'm competent, sir. I work hard to make sure I don't make mistakes that could affect other people. That's not what I asked. I asked if you believe you're good at what you do. Maria met his eyes, seeing something in his expression that suggested this was an important moment, that her answer mattered in ways she didn't fully understand. Yes, sir. I believe I'm good at what I do. Patterson nodded approvingly. Good. Because General Morrison has recommended you for immediate advancement and reassignment to a position where your talents can have greater impact. He pulled out another document from the file folder, this one bearing official seals and signatures that indicated high-level authorization. You're being promoted to specialist, effective immediately, and reassigned to Joint Task Force operations at Regional Command Headquarters. You'll be working directly with senior staff officers on strategic planning and multi-unit coordination. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Regional Command Headquarters was where generals and colonels made decisions that affected thousands of soldiers. Strategic planning was work done by officers with advanced degrees and years of experience. Multi-unit coordination involved responsibilities that could impact the success or failure of major military operations. Sir, I don't think I'm qualified for that level of responsibility. I don't have the education or the experience to work at that level. Patterson smiled, but it wasn't condescending. It was the expression of someone who had watched many young soldiers underestimate their own potential. Santos, do you know what General Morrison noticed about you that convinced her you were ready for greater responsibility? Maria shook her head, still struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. She noticed the way you maintained your uniform patch. She said it was sewn with mathematical precision, positioned exactly according to regulations, maintained in perfect condition despite the harsh environment. She said it demonstrated an attention to detail and commitment to standards that couldn't be taught or faked. Maria looked down at her shoulder, at the simple unit patch that she had indeed sewn herself according to precise measurements. It had never occurred to her that anyone would notice such a small detail, much less draw significant conclusions from it. She said that someone who brings that level of care to a simple uniform patch can be trusted to bring the same level of care to anything else they're asked to do. She said that kind of character is rare and valuable, especially at higher levels of responsibility where small details can have enormous consequences. Patterson pulled out a final document, this one clearly containing travel orders and administrative instructions. You'll be leaving tomorrow morning. Transport has been arranged, and your new commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Chun, is expecting you by 1400 hours. Colonel Chun specifically requested you based on General Morrison's recommendation. Maria stared at the orders, seeing her name typed in official fonts next to destinations and responsibilities that seemed to belong to someone else's life. Tomorrow morning, she would leave the forward operating base where she had found her place, where she had learned to trust her own competence, where she had discovered that she could contribute something meaningful to the mission. Sir, what about my current duties? My squad is depending on me for logistical support. Patterson's expression softened slightly. Your replacement arrived this morning. Sergeant Rodriguez has already begun the transition process. The unit will continue to function without interruption. The revelation that her replacement was already in place drove home the reality that this change was not a suggestion or a possibility to consider. It was an order, a decision that had been made at levels far above her influence or input. Sir, may I ask a question? Of course. Why me? There are other soldiers in this unit with more experience, better education, stronger leadership backgrounds. Why would General Morrison choose someone like me for this opportunity? Patterson stood up and walked back to his desk, but his posture remained relaxed and conversational. Santos, in my 26 years of service, I've learned that the Army's greatest strength isn't its technology or its strategies. It's the character of the people who choose to serve. General Morrison has spent her career identifying soldiers who embody the values that make our military effective. He gestured toward the photograph on his desk. She saw you doing ordinary work with extraordinary care, treating every task as if it mattered, supporting your fellow soldiers without seeking recognition. She saw someone who understands that excellence is a choice you make every day, not just when important people are watching. Maria felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had spent so much energy trying to remain invisible, trying to serve without being noticed, that she had never considered that invisibility itself might be what made her valuable. The army needs leaders who understand that the most important work often happens in the background, that the decisions that really matter are the ones you make when nobody's keeping score. General Morrison believes you already understand that, and she wants to put you in a position where that understanding can have greater impact. Patterson handed her the travel orders, and Maria accepted them with hands that trembled slightly. You report to Colonel Chin tomorrow at 1,400 hours. She'll explain your new responsibilities and help you understand how your skills will contribute to strategic operations. This is a significant opportunity, Santos, but it's also a significant responsibility. Maria stood up and rendered another sharp salute. Thank you for explaining the situation, sir. I won't disappoint General Morrison's confidence. I don't believe you will, Santos. And Santos? Yes, sir. The patch on your uniform that caught General Morrison's attention? Keep maintaining it with the same attention to detail. At your new assignment, people will be watching how you handle the small things to evaluate how you'll handle the big things. As Maria walked back across the base toward her quarters, she felt like she was moving through a dream. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. Tomorrow, she would leave the place where she had learned to trust her own competence and travel to a world where that competence would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. The simple patch on her uniform felt heavier now, weighted with new meaning and expectations. For 8 months, she had worn it as just another piece of required equipment. Now she understood that it had become a symbol of something larger, a representation of the values and character that had attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership. Tonight would be her last night as an invisible soldier doing ordinary work in the background. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter where invisibility was no longer an option, where the attention of senior leaders meant greater opportunities and greater responsibilities. She had no way of knowing whether she was ready for what came next, but she knew that she would approach it the same way she had approached everything else, with meticulous attention to detail, genuine commitment to serving others, and the understanding that even the smallest actions could have significance beyond what was immediately visible. The general had seen something in her that she was only beginning to see in herself. Tomorrow, she would begin discovering whether that something was enough. The helicopter approached Regional Command Headquarters as the morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Maria Santos pressed her face to the small window, watching as the sprawling complex grew larger below them. The contrast with her previous assignment was immediately obvious. Where the forward operating base had been utilitarian and compact, designed for functionality and defense, this facility looked like a small city dedicated to the business of strategic military operations. Buildings sprawled across several square miles, connected by paved roads and organized around a central complex that housed the command staff. Maria could see communication arrays reaching toward the sky, vehicle parks filled with everything from motorcycles to armored personnel carriers, and aircraft scattered across multiple runways and landing pads. This was where decisions were made that affected tens of thousands of soldiers across an entire theater of operations. As the helicopter touched down, Maria gathered her single duffel bag and prepared to step into a world where she knew nobody and understood very little about her role or responsibilities. The familiar weight of her uniform and the patch on her shoulder provided the only sense of continuity with the life she had known just 24 hours earlier. Colonel Sarah Chun was waiting at the landing pad, her presence immediately commanding even from a distance. She was shorter than Maria had expected, but her bearing and the way other soldiers moved around her made it clear that she was someone accustomed to authority and respect. As Maria approached and rendered her salute, Chin studied her with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Specialist Santos, welcome to Regional Command. I'm Colonel Chun, and I'll be your immediate supervisor for the foreseeable future. Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored to be here. Chin gestured toward a waiting vehicle, and as they drove through the complex, she provided a running commentary on the various buildings and operations. This facility coordinates military operations across 6 provinces and manages logistics for over 40,000 personnel. We handle everything from strategic planning to tactical support, from intelligence analysis to humanitarian assistance. It's complex work that requires people who can see both the big picture and the crucial details. Maria listened carefully, trying to absorb the scale and complexity of operations that dwarfed anything she had previously experienced. At her forward operating base, she had managed logistics for a few hundred soldiers. Here, those same types of decisions affected thousands of people and millions of dollars in resources. General Morrison's recommendation was quite specific. Chun continued as they pulled up to a modern office building. She said, "You have an unusual combination of technical competence and character that makes you suited for high-level coordination work. I'm curious to see if her assessment is accurate." They entered the building and took an elevator to the 3rd floor, where Chin's offices occupied a suite of rooms overlooking the Central Command complex. Maria followed her into a conference room with walls covered in maps, organizational charts, and operational timelines that represented the current status of multiple ongoing missions. "Sit down, Santos. Let's talk about what you'll be doing here." Maria took a seat at the large conference table, acutely aware that this room was where senior officers made decisions with consequences she was only beginning to understand. Chen pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal documents marked with various classification levels and distribution restrictions. "Your primary responsibility will be coordinating logistics and communication between multiple units operating in different geographic areas. You'll be tracking supply requirements, transportation schedules, maintenance needs, and personnel movements for operations involving up to 5,000 soldiers at a time." The numbers were staggering. Maria had never worked with logistics requirements involving more than a few dozen vehicles and a few hundred people. Now she was being asked to manage coordination for operations 50 times larger than anything in her experience. "Ma'am, I have to be honest. I've never managed logistics at this scale. I'm concerned that I might not have the experience necessary for this level of responsibility." Chen smiled, but it was an expression that suggested understanding rather than dismissal. "Santos, let me tell you something General Morrison said about you that convinced me to request your assignment. She said that in her observation, you approached every task as if other people's lives depended on getting it right. She said that kind of mindset is exactly what we need for strategic level work, because at this level, other people's lives really do depend on getting it right." Chen pulled out a laptop computer and opened it to display a complex spreadsheet containing hundreds of data points related to an ongoing operation. "This is a real-time logistics coordination matrix for Operation Desert Shield, which involves simultaneous movements by 12 different units across 4 provinces. Your job will be to maintain the accuracy of this data and coordinate changes with all participating units." Maria studied the spreadsheet, recognizing the basic structure from her previous work, but overwhelmed by the complexity and interdependence of the various elements. Transportation schedules were linked to supply requirements, which were connected to maintenance windows, which depended on personnel availability, which was affected by mission priorities that could change based on intelligence updates. How many people usually work on something like this? Normally, we have a team of 4 people managing different aspects of the coordination. But we're short-staffed right now, and General Morrison suggested that your attention to detail might make you capable of handling the entire coordination yourself. Maria felt a familiar sensation of being asked to perform beyond what seemed possible, but also a familiar determination to find a way to meet the challenge. She had learned at her previous assignment that capabilities often expanded to meet requirements when the mission was important enough. "What kind of training or support will I have? I'll spend today walking you through the systems and procedures. After that, you'll have direct communication links with all participating units and access to the senior staff if you need guidance on complex decisions. But most of the day-to-day coordination will be your responsibility." Chen spent the next 6 hours providing Maria with the most intensive training she had ever received. They reviewed every aspect of the coordination system, from the software interfaces to the communication protocols to the decision-making frameworks used when problems arose. Chen explained how small changes in one area could cascade through the entire operation, creating effects that might not become apparent until days later. The key to success at this level, Chen explained as they worked through a complex scenario involving weather delays and equipment shortages, is understanding that everything is connected to everything else. A maintenance problem with 3 vehicles can affect the timing of an entire operation if those vehicles are carrying critical communications equipment. By evening, Maria's head was swimming with new information and procedures, but she was beginning to see the patterns and logic that govern strategic-level coordination. The work was more complex than anything she had done before, but the fundamental principles were the same: accuracy, attention to detail, and understanding how individual actions affected the larger mission. Your first real test starts tomorrow, Chen said as they concluded the training session. We're launching a new phase of Operation Desert Shield that involves moving 1,500 soldiers and their equipment from 3 different bases to 2 new forward positions. The timeline is tight, the logistics are complex, and there's no margin for error. Maria nodded, feeling the familiar combination of nervousness and determination that came with significant challenges. Ma'am, may I ask why General Morrison specifically recommended me for this assignment? There must be other soldiers with more experience who could handle this work. Chen closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, studying Maria with the same careful attention she had shown during their initial meeting. Santos, have you ever wondered why some people succeed at higher levels of responsibility while others struggle? It's not usually about technical skills or previous experience. Those can be learned. It's about character traits that determine how someone approaches complex challenges. Chen stood up and walked to the window, gesturing toward the sprawling complex of buildings and operations visible outside. General Morrison told me that she watched you work for an entire day, and in all that time, she never saw you take a shortcut, never saw you treat any task as unimportant, never saw you do anything with less than complete attention and care. She said you approached routine logistics updates with the same intensity that most people reserve for emergencies. Maria remembered the day of General Morrison's visit, the ordinary routine of database updates and communication coordination that had seemed unremarkable at the time. At this level of operations, we can't afford to have people who only perform well when they're being watched or when the stakes are obviously high. We need people who bring their best effort to everything they do, because we often don't know which seemingly routine task will turn out to be critical to mission success. Chen turned back to face Maria directly. Your previous commander told General Morrison that you were the soldier he could count on to get things right the first time, every time. That's exactly the kind of reliability we need for strategic coordination work. The next morning, Maria arrived at her new workstation before dawn, wanting to review all the operational details one final time before the day's activities began. Her computer terminal was connected to communication networks that spanned continents, giving her real-time access to information about military operations in dozens of locations. As she logged into the coordination system, Maria felt the weight of responsibility settling around her like a heavy cloak. 1,500 soldiers were depending on her ability to manage logistics that would determine whether they had the equipment, supplies, and support they needed to complete their missions safely. The first challenge came at 0800 hours, when a transportation unit reported mechanical problems with 6 vehicles that were scheduled to carry critical communications equipment. The delay threatened to cascade through the entire operation timeline, potentially leaving 2 units without reliable communication links during a high-risk movement. Maria studied the problem from multiple angles, cross-referencing maintenance schedules, equipment inventories, and transportation alternatives. Within 30 minutes, she had developed a solution that involved redistributing the communications equipment across different vehicles, adjusting the departure times for 3 different units, and coordinating emergency maintenance support from 2 separate bases. The solution required 17 different units to make small changes to their plans, each of which had to be communicated clearly and confirmed before implementation could begin. Maria spent the next 2 hours managing this coordination, ensuring that every person involved understood exactly what they needed to do and when they needed to do it. When Colonel Chen checked on her progress at midday, she found Maria working with the focused intensity that had characterized her approach to every previous assignment. How are things going, Santos? Challenging, ma'am, but manageable. We've resolved the equipment issues from this morning, and all units are reporting green status for the afternoon movement. Chen reviewed the coordination logs on Maria's screen, noting the careful documentation of every decision and communication. Impressive work. How do you feel about managing this level of complexity? Maria considered the question honestly. The work was demanding and stressful, requiring constant attention and quick decision-making under pressure. But it was also intellectually engaging in a way that her previous assignments had not been, requiring her to understand not just individual tasks but entire systems of interconnected operations. It's more complex than anything I've done before, ma'am, but I'm finding that the fundamental principles are the same. Accuracy, attention to detail, and understanding how individual actions affect the larger mission. Chen nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. Keep that mindset, and you'll do well here. As the day progressed, Maria encountered a series of additional challenges that tested her ability to think systematically about complex problems. Weather delays required rerouting transportation through different geographic areas. Equipment shortages forced creative redistribution of resources between units. Communication failures necessitated backup coordination protocols that she had only learned about in theory. Each challenge required her to gather information quickly, analyze multiple options, coordinate with various personnel, and implement solutions that minimize disruption to the overall operation. The pace was relentless, and the consequences of mistakes were significant. But, as the afternoon wore on, Maria began to feel a familiar sense of competence and confidence. The work was complex, but it followed logical patterns that she could understand and manage. The principles that had served her well at the tactical level applied equally well at the strategic level. Careful attention to detail, systematic analysis of problems, clear communication of decisions, and constant awareness of how individual actions affected the larger mission. By evening, Operation Desert Shield had successfully completed its first phase, with all 1,500 soldiers and their equipment positioned according to plan. The coordination had required hundreds of individual decisions and communications, dozens of problem-solving interventions, and constant monitoring of changing conditions. Colonel Chen found Maria at her workstation, reviewing the day's activities and preparing reports for senior leadership. How do you feel after your first day managing strategic-level coordination? Maria looked up from her computer screen, feeling tired but satisfied with the day's accomplishments. Exhausting, ma'am, but successful. I'm beginning to understand why General Morrison thought this work might suit my capabilities. Chen smiled, pulling up a chair next to Maria's workstation. Santos, let me share something with you that might help put today's work in perspective. The operation you coordinated today positioned those 1,500 soldiers for a mission that could significantly impact the security situation in this region. The logistical precision you provided made it possible for them to arrive with the right equipment, adequate supplies, and effective communication capabilities. Maria had been so focused on the technical details of coordination that she hadn't fully considered the strategic implications of the work. Your attention to detail in managing transportation schedules, equipment distribution, and communication protocols directly contributed to mission readiness for an operation that could save lives and advance our strategic objectives in this theater. Chen gestured toward the patch on Maria's uniform, the same simple unit designation that had caught General Morrison's attention. General Morrison was right about you, Santos. You bring the same level of care to strategic coordination that you brought to routine logistics at your previous assignment. That consistency of character is exactly what we need at this level of operations. As Maria prepared to leave for her quarters, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred in her understanding of military service. Just a week earlier, she had seen herself as a background player whose contribution mattered mainly to her immediate unit. Now she understood that the same attention to detail and commitment to excellence could have impact at levels she had never imagined. The patch on her uniform had become a symbol of something larger than unit identification. It represented the values and character that connected her daily work to the broader mission of serving something greater than herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and greater responsibilities, but she was beginning to believe that she might be ready for whatever came next. For the first time since arriving at Regional Command, Maria Santos felt that she belonged in this world of strategic operations and high-level decision-making. Not because she had changed, but because she had discovered that the qualities that made her effective as an invisible soldier were exactly the same qualities that made her valuable as a strategic coordinator. The general had seen something in her that she was finally beginning to see in herself. 6 months after arriving at Regional Command Headquarters, Maria Santos had become the person that senior officers called when complex logistics coordination required absolute precision. Her reputation had grown quietly but steadily, spreading through the network of commanders who had come to depend on her ability to manage operations that others found overwhelming. The transformation had been gradual and almost invisible, much like Maria herself had been throughout her military career. She still approached each task with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her work at the forward operating base. But now that approach was being applied to operations that affected thousands of soldiers and millions of dollars in resources. Colonel Chun had watched this evolution with growing appreciation for General Morrison's insight in identifying Maria's potential. What had started as an experimental assignment had become an essential element of the command's operational capability. Santos, Chin said one morning as she reviewed the overnight reports, I need you to take on a special project. General Morrison is planning a visit next week to observe our operational coordination capabilities, and I want you to brief her on the systems we've developed. Maria looked up from her computer terminal, where she had been coordinating supply movements for an operation involving 4 different countries and 7 distinct military units. Ma'am, wouldn't it be more appropriate for you to brief General Morrison? I'm just implementing the systems and procedures that you and the senior staff developed. Chen smiled, recognizing the same modest deflection that had characterized Maria's approach to recognition throughout her time at Regional Command. Santos, you've been here 6 months. In that time, you've successfully coordinated 17 major operations, developed new procedures for multi-unit communication, and established coordination protocols that have been adopted by 3 other regional commands. You're not just implementing systems anymore. You're improving them. It was true, although Maria had never thought of her work in those terms. Each complex operation had taught her something new about the patterns and relationships that govern strategic coordination. When she encountered problems that existing procedures didn't address effectively, she had developed solutions and refinements that made future operations run more smoothly. The briefing isn't just about showing General Morrison what we do, Chin continued. It's about demonstrating how your approach to coordination has enhanced our operational capabilities. She needs to see the impact of her decision to identify and develop your potential. Maria spent the next week preparing for what felt like the most important presentation of her life. She reviewed every operation she had coordinated, documented the improvements she had made to existing procedures, and analyzed the data that showed how enhanced coordination had contributed to mission success rates across the region. The night before General Morrison's arrival, Maria sat in her quarters reviewing her notes and trying to manage the anxiety that came with knowing she would be evaluated by the officer who had changed the trajectory of her career. The simple patch on her uniform caught her eye in the mirror, and she remembered the conversation that had started everything. General Morrison arrived the next morning with an entourage that included 2 other generals and several senior staff officers from different regional commands. The visit was clearly about more than observing one facility's operations. It was part of a larger assessment of coordination capabilities across the entire theater. Maria watched from her workstation as the distinguished visitors toured the command center, observing the various operations and receiving briefings from senior leadership. She had been told to continue her normal work until called for the special briefing, so she focused on coordinating a complex resupply operation that involved helicopter transport across hostile territory. When Colonel Chun appeared at her workstation with General Morrison and the visiting party, Maria felt the familiar sensation of trying to make herself invisible while simultaneously knowing that invisibility was no longer an option. General Morrison, I'd like you to meet Specialist Santos, whom you identified and recommended for strategic coordination work 6 months ago. Maria stood and rendered her sharpest salute, meeting General Morrison's eyes with as much confidence as she could manage. Specialist Santos, it's good to see you again. Colonel Chin tells me you've been making quite an impact here. Thank you, ma'am. I've been privileged to work with excellent people on important missions. General Morrison gestured toward Maria's workstation, which displayed the complex coordination matrix for the ongoing resupply operation. Show me what you're working on right now. Maria turned to her computer and began explaining the operation, describing how 12 different helicopter flights needed to be coordinated with ground security, weather monitoring, communication support, and backup contingencies for potential equipment failures or enemy contact. As she spoke, she realized that she was no longer the nervous logistics specialist who had struggled to believe she deserved recognition. She had become someone who genuinely understood complex operations and could explain them clearly to senior leadership. The critical coordination point, Maria explained, highlighting specific elements on her screen, is ensuring that ground security is in position before the helicopters arrive, while maintaining communication protocols that allow for real-time adjustments if conditions change. General Morrison asked detailed questions about backup procedures, communication redundancies, and decision-making authority during crisis situations. Maria answered each question with confidence, drawing on 6 months of experience managing similar operations and the deeper understanding she had gained about how strategic coordination really worked. Impressive, one of the visiting generals observed. How long have you been managing operations at this level? 6 months, sir. This assignment has been an intensive learning experience. General Morrison studied Maria's workstation setup, noting the multiple monitors, communication systems, and reference materials arranged with the same precise organization that had characterized her previous work. Colonel Chun, could you give us some privacy? I'd like to have a personal conversation with Specialist Santos. Chun nodded and guided the other visitors toward a different area of the command center, leaving Maria alone with the general who had recognized her potential when she couldn't see it herself. Sit down, Santos. Let's talk about what you've learned during your time here. Maria settled into her chair, acutely aware that this was a pivotal conversation that would likely determine her future military career. Ma'am, this assignment has taught me that the principles of good military service are consistent regardless of the level of responsibility. Attention to detail, commitment to excellence, and understanding how individual actions affect the larger mission are equally important whether you're managing logistics for 100 soldiers or coordinating operations involving thousands. General Morrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of insight I hoped you would develop. What else have you learned? Maria considered the question carefully, thinking about the personal transformation she had experienced alongside the professional growth. I've learned that capabilities can expand to meet requirements when the mission is important enough. 6 months ago, I didn't believe I could manage strategic-level coordination. But when I applied the same approach that had worked for me at the tactical level, I discovered that I could handle much more complex responsibilities than I had imagined. And how do you feel about visibility? About being recognized for your contributions? Maria smiled slightly, remembering her constant efforts to remain invisible during her early military career. I've learned that visibility isn't something to fear when it comes from doing good work rather than seeking attention. The recognition I've received here has been based on results and contributions, not self-promotion. That kind of visibility feels earned rather than accidental. General Morrison gestured toward the patch on Maria's uniform, the same simple unit designation that had caught her attention during their first meeting. When I first noticed that patch, I was struck by the precision with which you maintained it. It suggested someone who understood that even small details mattered when you were representing something larger than yourself. How do you think about that patch now? Maria looked down at her shoulder, seeing the familiar unit designation with new understanding. Ma'am, I've come to realize that this patch represents more than just my unit assignment. It's a symbol of the values and standards that guide everything I do. The way I maintain it reflects the way I approach every responsibility, and it reminds me that I'm part of something much larger than my individual role. General Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Maria with satisfaction. Santos, I'm going to share something with you that will explain why this conversation is particularly important. The Army is implementing a new program to identify and develop strategic leadership potential among enlisted personnel. The program will select soldiers who demonstrate exceptional character and competence for advanced training and accelerated promotion opportunities. Maria felt her pulse quicken, sensing that this conversation was leading toward another life-changing moment. I've been tasked with recommending the first candidates for this program, and your performance over the past 6 months has confirmed my initial assessment. I want to recommend you for selection as one of the program's founding members. The implications were staggering. Advanced training meant education opportunities she had never imagined. Accelerated promotion meant responsibilities and authority far beyond her current level. Selection as a founding member meant becoming part of a program that could reshape her entire career trajectory. Ma'am, I'm honored by your confidence, but I want to make sure you understand what you're recommending. I'm still a specialist with less than 2 years of military service. There must be other candidates with more experience and education who would be better qualified for this opportunity. General Morrison smiled, recognizing the same thoughtful humility that had characterized Maria's approach to every previous opportunity. Santos, let me tell you what qualifications really matter for strategic leadership in the modern military. We need people who can manage complexity without losing sight of fundamental principles. We need people who can earn trust through consistent competence rather than demanding authority through rank or position. We need people who understand that excellence is a choice they make every day, not just when important people are watching. General Morrison stood up and walked to the window, gesturing toward the sprawling complex of military operations visible outside. Your experience over the past 6 months has demonstrated all of those qualities. You've managed operations involving thousands of soldiers and millions of dollars in resources. You've developed new procedures that have improved coordination capabilities across multiple commands. You've earned the respect and confidence of senior officers who depend on your competence for mission success. She turned back to face Maria directly. Most importantly, you've maintained the same character and approach that caught my attention in the first place. You still treat every task as if it matters, still bring complete attention and care to everything you do, still focus on supporting others rather than advancing yourself. Maria felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she maintained her composure. This was a professional conversation with strategic implications, not a personal moment for emotional display. Ma'am, if you believe I can contribute to this program, then I'm honored to accept the opportunity. I'll work as hard as necessary to justify your confidence. General Morrison returned to her chair and pulled out a folder containing official documents. The program begins in 3 months at the Army War College. You'll spend a year in intensive study covering strategic planning, international relations, organizational leadership, and advanced military doctrine. Following that, you'll be assigned to positions of increasing responsibility that will test your ability to apply what you've learned. Maria accepted the documents with hands that trembled slightly, seeing her name typed on forms that would determine the next phase of her life. There's one more thing I want you to understand about this opportunity, General Morrison said. You won't be the only person in this program who started as an enlisted soldier without traditional qualifications. But you will be one of the few people selected primarily because of character rather than credentials. General Morrison pointed again to the patch on Maria's uniform. That patch caught my attention because of how you maintained it, but it kept my attention because of what it represented about your approach to service. The Army needs leaders who understand that the most important work often happens in the background, that the decisions that really matter are the ones you make when nobody's keeping score. As their conversation concluded and General Morrison prepared to continue her tour, she offered one final observation that would stay with Maria for the rest of her career. Santos, you started this journey thinking you were invisible, believing that your contributions only mattered in the background. What you've learned is that the kind of character that drives you to excel in the background is exactly what we need in visible leadership positions. That evening, as Maria sat in her quarters reviewing the documents that would reshape her future, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had begun with a general noticing how she maintained a simple uniform patch. She had spent most of her military career trying to remain invisible, convinced that recognition meant becoming a target for expectations she couldn't meet. But invisibility had been impossible when her character and competence made her contributions essential to mission success. The patch on her uniform had become a symbol of something much larger than unit identification. It represented the understanding that excellence was a choice, that character was demonstrated through daily actions, and that the most important service often happened when nobody was watching. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for the next phase of her journey, knowing that the same principles that had served her as an invisible soldier would guide her as a visible leader. The general had seen something in her that she was finally able to see in herself, the potential to serve something greater than herself at levels she had never imagined possible. Maria Santos was no longer invisible, but she had learned that true leadership meant maintaining the same character and values regardless of whether anyone was watching. The patch on her shoulder would always remind her that how she maintained the small things revealed everything about how she would handle the big things. The girl who had grown up believing she was meant to disappear into the background had discovered that some people are meant to lead from the front, not because they seek attention, but because their character makes it impossible for them to remain hidden when important work needs to be done. General Morrison had been right about everything. The patch had changed everything, not because it was special, but because of what it revealed about the person who wore it.